Then he went home, and the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, "He has gone out of his mind." And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, "He has Beelzebub, and by the ruler of the demons he casts out demons." And he called them to him and spoke a parable. "How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand. His end has come. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man, and then indeed the house can be plundered."
Walt Whitman's brother was wounded while fighting in the Civil War, and Whitman worked as a psychological nurse tending to the wounded and dying in Washington, D.C. hospitals during the war. He was known for his cheerful disposition and careful attention to the welfare of the soldiers. But here, he tells us some of the sorrow of war and warring. A sight in camp in the daybreak gray and dim, as from my tent I emerge so early sleepless, as slow I walk in the cool fresh air, the path nearby the hospital tent. 3 forms I see on stretchers lying, brought out there untended, lying over each the blanket spread, ample brownish woolen blanket, gray and heavy blanket, folded, covering all. Curious, I halt and stand silent. Then, with light fingers, I from the face of the nearest, the first, just lift the blanket. Who are you, elderly man, so gaunt and grim, with well-grayed hair and flesh all sunken about the eyes? Who are you, my dear comrade? Then to the second I step. And who are you, my child and darling? Who are you, sweet boy, with cheeks yet blooming? Then to the third, a face nor child nor old, very calm, as of beautiful yellow-white ivory. Young man, I think I know you. I think this face is the face of Christ himself, dead and divine and brother of all. And here again he lies.
The Lyman Beecher Lectureship was founded in 1871 by a gift of $10,000 from Henry W. Sage of Brooklyn, New York, as a memorial to the great divine whose name it bears. The income of this fund is used for an annual series of lectures on a topic appropriate to the work of the ministry. A word or two about the history of the founding of this lectureship I think is appropriate. Henry W. Sage, the donor of funds for the establishment of the lectureship, was a member of the Plymouth Congregational Church of Brooklyn, where Henry Ward Beecher, son of Lyman Beecher, was pastor for 40 years. Sage was a prosperous businessman and one of the chief benefactors of Cornell University, where he served on the Board of Trustees. In accordance with the wishes of Mr. Sage, his gift to Yale was devoted by the Yale Corporation to the establishment of a foundation to be designated as the Lyman Beecher Lectureship on Preaching, to be filled from time to time, upon appointment of the corporation, by a minister of the gospel of any evangelical denomination who has been markedly successful in the special work of Christian ministry. With the authorization of the donor, the corporation voted in May 1882 that henceforth the Lyman Beecher lecturer shall be invited to lecture on a branch of pastoral theology or in any other topic appropriate to the work of Christian ministry. In December 1893, the donor authorized the corporation that if at any time they should deem it desirable to do so, they might appoint a layman instead of a minister to deliver a course of lectures for the Lyman Beecher Foundation. The first Beecher lecture series was given by Henry Ward Beecher during the academic year 1871-72. The first lecture series, Yale Lectures on Preaching, was later published by J.B. Ford and Company in New York under the title of Personal Elements in Preaching. There's a distinguished roster of former Beecher lecturers, including David Napier, William Sloane Coffin, Phyllis Tribble, Krister Stendhal, Walter Brueggemann, Leander Keck, and Harry Baker Adams, both here today, Barbara Brown Taylor, Peter Gomes, David Bartlett, and Otis Moss. It is my distinct pleasure to add to that number this year's Beecher lecturer. You can see from the biographical information on the back of your program what a distinguished scholar and teacher we have in Skip Stout. One of the things we like to say to ourselves here at Yale in thinking about our senior appointments is that we look for colleagues who go beyond the confines of the lecture hall and seminar room and shape their fields, who have an impact that extends to the academic world generally. Skip exemplifies that quality in an extraordinary way. Through his leadership of the Center for the Advanced Study of Religion, he and his colleague John Butler have supported the work of dozens of promising young historians and students of religion. Through his leadership of the Jonathan Edwards Center, he and his able co-workers, Ken Minkema, now Caleb Maskell, and numerous other scholars, have made a foundational contribution to the study of religion in colonial America. Their publication of the works of Jonathan Edwards now comprises some 30 hardbound volumes and will be continued with an online publication of the remainder of the Edwards corpus. That publication makes a rich store of primary material from one of the greatest American minds in early American history available for scholars. For the last several years, while fulfilling his responsibilities as master of Berkeley College, then director of graduate studies and now chair of the Department of Religious Studies, Skip has been busy with a major new book on the moral history of the Civil War. I suspect that we'll be hearing about some of the things he's been working on, about how preachers and religious leaders, among others, dealt with the greatest moral challenge of the 19th century, and we'll all be enormously enriched by what he will have to say today and for the next 2 days. His lecture today in the series Preaching Morality in America's Civil War is entitled The American Jeremiad, Divided Against Itself. Please join me in welcoming this year's Beecher lecturer, Skip Stout.
Thank you very much, Harry, for an overly generous introduction. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be here and to be giving the Beecher Lectures, and indeed you will be getting a preview into the book that I've been working on for the past 12 years. So consider yourselves lucky that you can get by with a couple of lectures. Harry Adams, at last. At last. Harry has been after me to give these Beecher Lectures, I think, ever since I first got to Yale Divinity School, which would be 1986. And I kept putting them off as much as I could, and as I put them off, the subject matter gradually evolved. It was originally going to be on the Puritan sermons, and then Jonathan Edwards, and then Harry had the idea of a series of lectures on the Beecher Lectures themselves. And then I got involved with the Civil War, and I said, I can't write a history of the Beecher Lectures themselves, but I can talk about preaching in the Civil War, because that's really a central component of the book. But throughout, Harry was prodding me in the gentle way that Harry does. So, Harry, for your patience and perseverance, I'm dedicating these lectures to you. Whether at the end of the day you're glad for that remains to be seen. I want to begin today by talking about my understanding of what a moral history of the Civil War should look like and what it should do. This discussion, I hope, will set the stage for particular attention to battles and the home front in the following 2 lectures. Throughout, my focus will be on sermons, as I'm sure Lyman Beecher would approve, and certainly even more his son Henry Ward Beecher, who played such an influential role religiously and politically throughout the Civil War. First, some context for those of you who are not yet, anyway, Civil War buffs. The centrality of the Civil War to American history and American identity speaks for itself. Numbers count, and nowhere is this more true in American history than the Civil War. Directly, the war would claim 1 million military casualties, including 620,000 dead from battle, disease, and most loathsome of all, prisoner of war camps. Indirectly, at least 50,000 civilians died from exposure to the war, and 108,000 women were left widowed. These cumulative casualty counts in a total population of only 30 million almost equal losses from all other American wars combined. If translated into an equal proportion of the current U.S. population, the casualty rate would total 10 million American soldiers and sailors and countless civilians. Without exaggeration, one can say that in terms of death, the Civil War was America's most appalling act of human destruction. The centrality of the Civil War to American memory is equally profound. The Gettysburg Address stands as America's greatest national sermon, delivered, you might recall, on the year anniversary of 9/11 by Governor Pataki. And Lincoln's second inaugural serves as the nation's Sermon on the Mount. The number of books on the Civil War is simply staggering and testifies to the ongoing power of the war to shape a national identity. I'm told there are more books on Lincoln in America than on anyone else except Jesus Christ. And not a few people are going to identify the two. Gone with the Wind remains America's bestseller. In all, there has been one book on the Civil War published every day since Appomattox. Reenactors stage mock battles religiously and range from amateur farbs to hardcore realists marching barefoot to war, just like the originals. For a fabulous read, by the way, on these, and humorous read on these reenactors, I recommend Tony Horwitz's Confederates in the Attic. Roundtable discussions are nationwide events, even in areas never touched by the Civil War. PBS gained credibility and major numbers when a filmmaker named Ken Burns offered a riveting documentary of the war that continues to raise major audiences. But in all this preservation and celebration, there are some disturbing gaps in the literature. Remarkably, in all of these books and films and discussions, hardly anyone has explored the moral and religious dimensions of the conflict. Hard questions remain embedded in a coalition of silence. True, themes of emancipation, liberty, and a new birth of freedom for the slaves ring loud and triumphant, shouting America's greatness to the world. But the underlying question, well, was it just, remains mute. With the war's justice assumed, all that's left on the moral front is to celebrate the fact that the right side won. But is the justness of the Civil War that simple? Historian Edward Ayers has recently worried about this, literally. In an essay entitled Worrying About the Civil War, Ayers argues, and I quote, "It may be that we like the current story too much to challenge it very deeply, and that we foreclose questions by repeating familiar formulas. The risk of our apparent consensus is that we paper over the complicated moral issues raised by war that left hundreds of thousands of people dead. The risk is that we no longer worry about the Civil War." Well, fear not. In the lectures to come, we will worry about what most Americans, including scholars, celebrate. We will ask, how did statesmen and generals conduct the war in terms of both armies against armies and soldiers against civilians? And relatedly, how did ordinary Northerners and Southerners in and out of the Army justify a level of killing that reached 1 million casualties? What, in other words, might a moral history of the Civil War look like? In writing a moral history, the historian, or at least this historian, does not presume to be a sort of Supreme Court justice, adjudicating the past, trying the actors for their crimes, and then sentencing them. The dead no longer care, and they cannot be sentenced. Rather, it is for the living that the historian offers moral judgments in the hope that lessons for today may ensue. Moral history imbues the present with a heightened sensitivity to what actors might have done, what they ought to have done, and what, in fact, they actually did. It is in the distances between the ought and the actualities that moral judgments emerge. One bears witness to the past with all possible integrity and disinterestedness for the sake of the present and the future. Current debates over American wars in the 21st century dramatically confirm the contested nature of war among good people. The reason is simple. At its most elemental, war is evil. War is killing. War is destroying. It may be a necessary evil, and in that sense, right, but it is nevertheless lethally destructive. So real-world questions about war and morality will always strain any theory created to justify it, and will always invite debate, and will always ensure there will not be unanimity of opinion. In these lectures, I pay particular attention to those aspects of the war that raise moral issues. Such issues appear on the home front in the trenches, among foot soldiers and civilians, no less than generals and presidents. How then does this historian render moral judgments about a war? I should invoke Gene Alka to come up here and tell us, but I won't single him out like that. By holding up the actions against widely recognized, long-established principles of just war, sometimes summarized as just war theory. In asking how a war should be fought, theorists isolate two primary principles. Actually, they isolate a lot of principles, but two are especially important for my purposes: proportionality and discrimination. The former, proportionality, requires that goals be proportional to the means employed. Granted that all soldiers at some level give up their right to life. I'll repeat that. Granted that at some level all soldiers give up their right to life by enlisting in armed forces. Even so, principles of proportionality still invoke limits to the carnage. If 20,000 Marines were annihilated in another raid on Fallujah, many would judge that to be disproportional and maybe even criminal. What about the Civil War, where, for example, on one day at Antietam, 20,000 Americans were killed or wounded in suicidal frontal assaults? To this day, Antietam stands as the bloodiest day in American history, and I hope it stands forever as the bloodiest day in American history. But was it disproportional and therefore wrong? Hint, there won't be agreement in this room. Get used to it. The second category falls under the broad label discrimination and addresses the question of who should be considered legitimate targets in war. Non-combatants are deemed to stand outside the field of war proper. Thus, it is unjust to attack them. Just war theory unanimously upholds the protection of civilians. No element of judgment or prudential weighing of costs and benefits is acceptable in deciding whether or not to target civilians or to take them hostage. It is always wrong. Of course, warfare sometimes unavoidably involves civilians who get caught up in the fighting. Today, we use the term collateral damage to describe these tragic situations. Just war theorists address the topic of collateral damage in terms of double effect. The doctrine of double effect justifies killing civilians in war only if their deaths are not intended but accidental. So, for example, targeting an undefended city is not permissible. But targeting a military establishment in the middle of a city is. The target is the military unit and not the civilians inadvertently caught up in the struggle. Issues of proportionality of losses to strategic end and discrimination of legitimate and illegitimate targets will recur in these lectures. While the theory remains clear in the abstract, at least to me, that is, without actual numbers in play, its application in the Civil War, the determination of right or wrong, is far from clear or unanimous, both from the vantage point of the participants and later observers, including all of us in this room. This becomes especially true in the last years of the war as it escalated from a limited war fought by armies in the field to a total war in which civilians and their property were deliberately targeted. As the war, I need to say something also at this point in addition to the theory about slavery and emancipation. As the war escalated from a limited war into a total war in 1862, the moral justification changed in the North from a limited war for union to a moral crusade for freedom and abolition. Unlike proportionality and discrimination in war, slavery would grow ever more powerful in the foreground role throughout the war. With emancipation, it would represent Lincoln's inner accelerator for mounting a total war on the Confederacy, soldier and civilian alike. And with abolition, it would provide an unambiguous moral triumph. The justness of abolition and the freedom of 4 million slaves dictates that any moral history of slavery unconditionally conclude that the right side won, no matter what the casualties and sacrifices. Lincoln was right when he said in his second inaugural in March of 1865 that if God willed that the war, quote, continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with a lash shall be paid by another drawn with a sword, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. But these lectures and my larger project are not a moral history of slavery. They offer instead a moral history of a war where questions of proportionality and discrimination continue to remain in play. In any moral history of slavery, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation would be unquestionably right and good. But in a moral history of the war, the Emancipation Proclamation becomes more problematic if it was employed by Lincoln and Northern Republicans generally as a lever, this was Lincoln's term, for a total war on the Confederacy that deliberately targeted civilian farms, cities, and in at least 50,000 instances, civilian lives. I might say very quickly that my figure of 50,000 civilian lives I think is minimal. It's based on the great Civil War historian James McPherson, and he never tells in that book exactly how he comes up with that number, and I mean to ask him. But it's staggering that in all the literature on the Civil War, no one has really explored the subject of civilian casualties. In a moral history of the Civil War, it is not enough merely to say that the end of human bondage in the United States was worth 1 million white lives, true as that may be. The separate question of war remains, was it just? And here I will argue that the right side won in spite of itself. Instead of a just war dictated by prudent considerations of proportionality and protection of non-combatants, I argue that in too many instances, both sides descended into moral misconduct. Okay, with this as background, it's time to start the war. And listen in on the clergy as they forge their cases for violent confrontation. On April 12, 1861, Jefferson Davis, President and Commander-in-Chief, and Chief of the newly created Confederate States of America, ordered Confederate General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, you got to love that name, if not Beauregard, to reduce the fortress at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor as an unwanted foreign presence. The order was duly carried out, and after a relatively brief artillery exchange in which no one was killed, the commander of Fort Sumter, Robert Anderson, surrendered. With the firing on Fort Sumter, 20 years of accumulated frustration, occasional violence, and overheated rhetoric at last ignited a war whose outcome was unknown to everyone. Americans on both sides were not prepared morally for war any more than they were prepared politically or militarily. Throughout the early debates and saber-rattling, few asked hard questions about the morality of war should it erupt. The word war was on everyone's lips, either as a tragedy to be avoided or an adventure to be embraced. But few explored the moral meaning of war or the laws of war with reference to a potential civil war. By failing to address issues of just war before hostilities ensued, the stage was effectively set for Americans to ignore them after hostilities began. For such moral unpreparedness, both sides would pay a horrific price. With Sumter, national patriotism triumphed in the North and the South. Before then, there were few symbols of national unification. About the only thing you would have to do with the federal government, if you were an ordinary person, was when you voted every 4 years and when you went to the post office. Other than that, everything was local and regional. State and local governments governed American life. In the early republic, the American flag, the clearest and most literal emblem of patriotism, was barely visible. Flags were limited largely to merchant and naval ships. None flew from homes or churches. Sumter would change this overnight. Flags began flying everywhere. I can't help but recall when I began writing about Sumter in September of 2001, everything I'm reading about in the responses north and south to the bombing of Sumter was occurring all around me as flags suddenly appeared everywhere. A nation draped in flags was a nation draped in war. Overnight, the flag became the symbol of national unity and a vastly expanded federal and Confederate government. Northern and Southern clergy, no less than Northern and Southern intellectuals, fell victim to the sheer power of patriotism following Sumter. And think back to your feelings after 9/11. The capitulation of the clergy, North and South, to their nation-state's political and military agenda would prove devastating. Ministers and religious writers alike were, after all, the most important moral authorities for fixing each section's redemptive mission and sacred claims, with local connections in every community throughout the land. North and South would enlist them for the task of the sacred legitimation necessary to mount a mutually defined defensive war that would be just in the eyes of God. Without that benediction, think about it, how could millions of primarily Protestant evangelical young men kill hundreds of thousands of their evangelical counterparts in good conscience? How did the clergy accomplish their conversion to patriotism? In terms of national identity, the North had long adopted the Puritans' rhetoric of America as a redeemer nation, or as the new Israel. By 1861, American messianism became even more ingrained and as instinctual to elite opinion shapers as to ordinary women and men. The rituals of fast and Thanksgiving days, begun in 17th century New England, continued to serve as major occasions to preach righteousness and celebrate chosen peoplehood. They articulated what intellectual historian Perry Miller dubbed, quote, an American Jeremiah, that spelled out America's sacred identity as a redeemer nation, engaged in a special covenant with God to save the world. However they saw the role of slavery in perverting the South, most Northern arbiters in 1861 agreed that the ultimate goal of the war was the preservation of the Union. Because of the United States' divine commission to be a redeemer nation, preserving the Union was a sufficient cause, because this is not just one more profane nation in the wilderness of this world. The Confederacy responded in kind to the Northern Jeremiah, hence the Jeremiah divided against itself, playing off against the scripture passage that we heard read earlier. They respond in kind and create their own Jeremiah. But the moral and spiritual creation of a national identity in the Confederacy would not be accomplished so readily as in the North. They had no rhetorical heritage that remained solely their invention. Instead, a new Confederate Jeremiad would have to be invented, or more precisely appropriated, from the heretical North. The Confederate capital of Richmond, unlike the Union capital, not only had to invent a nation with a constitution all its own, but also invest that new creation with the highest spiritual and moral legitimacy. And here I return again to that earlier question. How could avowedly Christian Confederate citizens be persuaded to kill and be killed? The Southern clergy's new burden of political preaching was made immensely easier by the new Confederate Constitution, adopted on February 8 and ratified March 11, 1861. Unlike its federal counterpart, it explicitly declared its Christian identity, quote, invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God. The national motto, with God as our defender, added additional weight to the South's claim to be a uniquely Christian nation. Now is the time, President Davis proclaimed, to consecrate the new nation and, quote, to recognize our dependence upon God and supplicate His merciful protection. This meant that the South was now in a position more analogous to ancient Israel or Puritan New England than to that of the North. The Constitution of the Union, after all, failed to invoke or even mention God. The Confederacy was going on record as a Christian nation in a unique covenant with God. Even as the North's claim to political sovereignty was declared null and void, so also were its claims to a covenant with God annulled. The North's Constitution, drafted as it was by deists and atheists, failed to invoke God's name. Any Northern claims to a special relationship were therefore spurious. God smiled on a Confederacy, happy to recognize him and claim him as her own. I should say, in all the rhetoric that I've read, God does a lot of smiling. If God did as much smiling as the rhetoric suggested, he must have been downright jocular when he got to the last year of the war, because he sure is smiling on the causes. By the way, I'm using the his to keep it in the 19th century language or context that the speakers fell back on. When Confederate lawmakers introduced God explicitly into their national constitution, they had no idea of the significance that that act would later assume in American history. It would not only solidify the South's identity as a Christian republic, but it would also supply a surprisingly powerful critique of a godless Northern constitution. It would inspire Northern Republican Party campaigns to get God into their constitution and correct the oversight of the Founding Fathers. In the process, it would set off a debate that continues to the present over the meaning of America. With separation of church and state, and in the culture of religious freedom, could America still be a Christian nation? For the South, and most Republicans in the North, the answer was an unequivocal yes. The premier occasions for articulating the Confederate Jeremiad would be the same as the North's: public fast days and Thanksgiving days. The mission was to articulate the terms of God's national covenant with the Confederacy and to interpret the meaning of current events within those terms. The special days were proclaimed by non-clerical public officials, chiefly the president, and observed by civil law throughout the land. Although the frequency of fasts ebbed and flowed depending on the state of battles and public affairs, fast days never disappeared. Instead, they stood as ritual markers to proclaim a peculiar peoplehood modeled on ancient Israel. In Richmond, at the start of the war, the Reverend O.S. Barton explained that God recognized the collective nation as, quote, a moral person, and rewarded or punished it in this world because, like all nations, it would have no existence in the afterlife. Quote, nations are but aggregates of individuals who compose them, and what God requires of one in his individual capacity, he demands of the whole in their associated character. Battlefield defeats were God's punishments for the sins of the people, while victories were signs of God's pleasure. For the Confederacy to adopt the public fast day as its own national ritual of self-affirmation, a profound revolution had to have taken place in a highly compressed period of time. Where the Puritans took 2 generations to invent a rhetoric of nationhood and war around the ritual convention of the fast and Thanksgiving days, the Confederacy achieved it in a year, and it grew thereafter until the very last battles were lost and beyond. I'm thinking of the so-called religion of the lost cause in the post-war South. Public fast sermons enlisted Christianity for ritual and ideological service to the Confederacy, even though Southern churches for decades had established their difference from the North by reflexively affirming the apolitical spirituality of the church, and with it, the principle that they would say nothing about civil or political affairs. This is an argument that they would return to again after the war as grounds for silence on the subjects of segregation and Jim Crow. While ministers would continue to celebrate the historic spirituality of the Southern pulpit, they would at the same time ring the charges of tyranny against the North and preach political liberty for the South with a ferocity and frequency unmatched in the North. For Southern clergy, like the Northern clergy, the war proved to be irretrievably costly. As clergy rushed headlong to promote the war effort and the presidents who conducted it, they found themselves simultaneously liberated and co-opted. They would be freed to expand their pulpit commentary and religious press from spirituality to politics and support for the war. But in that very liberation, they would be captured by the state and its political agenda. Once set, it was a trap they never escaped for the duration of the war and again beyond. The language of the covenant in Jeremiah was hardly limited to the clergy. Indeed, the power of the Jeremiah lay in its inclusivity. Statesmen and generals, intellectuals and journalists, housewives and children could invoke it no less than pastors. For the Jeremiah to work as a ritual of social order, all had to be true believers. This is precisely what happened as the language took on the status of deep national myth. Throughout the lifetime of the Confederacy, nearly 3/4 of all printed sermons would be public fast or Thanksgiving sermons, or similar political and war-related sermons preached on other days. Once a rarity in Southern print, these sermons became a staple religious product of the Confederate press. I had a graduate student do a survey of everything published in the Confederacy during the Civil War, and we found that religious publications as a whole would amount to over 40% of the unofficial imprints appearing in the Confederacy through the war, nearly half. That's pretty much been completely ignored. Of course, printed sermons represented only a small fraction of total fast and Thanksgiving sermons preached in the Confederacy during the Civil War, but they remain a useful index to what was heard publicly throughout the Confederacy, in churches and synagogues of all faiths and denominations, and an index to what was preached to soldiers in the Army. Once the Confederacy was educated in the moral logic of the Jeremiah through sermons, newspaper comments, and presidential proclamations, Southerners truly internalized the message. Each victory would be interpreted as God's work, a gracious favor just short of the miraculous that signified a triumph of divine justice. A defeat, however, was never a sign that the cause was not righteous, or that God had deserted his chosen people, but rather that God was purifying his people through the fires of adversity, so that they would come to depend only on him. At that point, victory would be granted. It is precisely for this reason that people on both sides of the conflict never seriously thought about the possibility of defeat. Their theology would not allow it. I was struck that the day Lincoln conquered Richmond with his son, they discovered in the mud the prior day's newspaper with the headline, "Deliverance is Coming." Nor did many weigh the costs. The Jeremiah, and this is important to keep in mind, I think to understand levels of destruction, the Jeremiah taught them that God, not man, was determining the costs and proportions, so that all one could do was absorb the butcher's bill and pay with reverence. For their part, Northern Christian Republicans were certain that secession was not only politically untenable, but ultimately a sin against God, because ultimately America was God's country and not merely we the people's country. By thus presenting the Union in absolutist moral terms, Northern voices imputed the same moral urgency and global redemption to political union and democracy that abolitionists had injected into universal emancipation. It was this very absolutism for union among Republicans and emancipation among abolitionists, who were far fewer in numbers. At the time of the Civil War, William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, had gone down to about 1,200 subscriptions. But it was this very absolutism in the beginning for union among Republicans and emancipation among abolitionists that made it difficult for either Northern wing to support the other's moral platform in the early stages of the war. For their part, Northern Democrats and Confederate moral critics perceived from the outset how easily unionism and abolitionism could come together and be fused into one moral absolute with devastating consequences. Consequences that would dictate a total war for unconditional surrender and involuntary reconstruction. Indeed, by overestimating the strength and numbers of Northern abolitionists, Confederates assumed such a fusion from the start, so that when emancipation was eventually proclaimed by Lincoln, no Southerner was surprised or aroused in any way like the North. On Sunday afternoon, mark the day, July 21st, 1861, the first big battle was fought at Bull Run, Virginia, or Manassas. Citizens gathered to witness a splendid battle that they anticipated to unfold in front of them, some with picnic lunches in hand. But soon the scene would turn unimaginably ugly. After initial Yankee gains, the rebels regrouped under their intrepid commander Thomas Jackson, later nicknamed Stonewall Jackson, and turned the apparent Federal gains into an unseemly rout. When a Confederate shell hit a wagon on Cub Run Bridge, blocking the Federal retreat, Federal troops panicked and soon became ungovernable. Soldiers mingled with congressmen and sightseers in frantic retreat, elbowing one another out of the way. The only thing that stopped a complete takeover was a spirited defense led by a Mexican War veteran, then Colonel William Tecumseh Sherman, who we will encounter at some length in the third lecture. A jubilant President Davis turned up on horseback at the battlefield to witness the capture of hundreds of Union prisoners and savor his victory. Instead of celebrating victory, and in the process setting off a fight for bragging rights with General Beauregard, Davis should have been urging his soldiers on. But that would have required an experienced military mind that Davis only thought he possessed. Fortunately for the Union, the Confederates were equally unprepared for a real battle and failed to pursue and destroy McDowell's army. Davis's failure to organize and order a night pursuit into Washington cost him the Confederacy's probable best opportunity to end the war on Confederate terms. Heavy rains the next day erased all opportunity for a Confederate knockout victory, and Washington, D.C. remained safely in Federal hands. The toll from Bull Run seemed incredible at the time, and to disbelieving eyes lined up at telegraph offices and reading newspapers probably had greater effect than later battlefield reports that would yield far, far larger numbers. Citizens on both sides were startled to learn that combined casualties totaled 5,000. The shock lay in the fact that almost as many Americans had been killed at Bull Run as in the entire Mexican War fought 14 years earlier. An unjust war, American war, if ever there was one. Sadly, those numbers would pale in comparison to the carnage to follow. Throughout the Confederacy, sermons and ecclesiastical reports invoked battlefield successes to proclaim the divine truth of the Southern Jeremiah's message. Surprise, surprise. The Presbyterian Synod of Virginia's annual report in 1862 would identify the public fast as the cause of victory at Bull Run. Quote, "At first, God did not seem to smile on our defensive operations. Then God put it into the heart of President Davis to call for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer. The united supplication of the whole people went up before the God of battles, and was graciously accepted through the intercession of our great high priest, we were wonderfully delivered out of the hands of our enemies. If Fort Sumter prompted Northern moderates to support war rather than secession in April, there were a lot who wanted to say before Sumter, good riddance to bad rubbish, just let the South go, stick with their institution of slavery, and be judged by God. That changed after secession. After the bloodshed at Bull Run 3 months later, they were prompted to hate the enemy as malicious and effective killers who, without formal recognition as a nation, nevertheless fought as a nation, and savagely at that. No moral reflection on the rules of war surfaced, even in the religious press. Only a demand for blood revenge. A writer for the New York Evangelist wrote, and I quote, "We are now opening our eyes to the unwelcome fact that they are enemies of the country and must be dealt with as traitors. This once settled, scruples fast vanish about the mode of conducting the war. We feel bound to use every means in our power to put down a rebellion which is striking at the very life of the nation." At the same time the evangelist advocated using every means in our power, it issued a bold and prescient proposal, certain to support a total war. And again I quote, "When hundreds and thousands of our brave young soldiers are brought home from the bloody field, when there is a cry in the land like the wailing in Egypt because in every house there is one dead, the question will be asked, why not make a speedy end of this dreadful business by at once proclaiming freedom to the slaves? Whatever rights Southerners had before as loyal citizens, they have forfeited by their treason and rebellion." At this point, Lincoln did not agree. He changes his mind later. The South, too, saw the prospect of total war at Bull Run. On September 26, 1861, a day that Northern churches were spending in the churches fasting, the Charleston Mercury carried an ominous report entitled "Negro Slaves, Contraband of War." And I quote, "These virtuous abolitionists of New England, when they can steal or get into possession of the Negro slaves of Maryland and Virginia, no longer talk of emancipation. They take possession of them as property. It is not enough that we arm and go forth to battle. We must do so with the desperate conviction that we fight along the edge of the precipice. We must smite unsparingly, with sweeping vengeance, and not merely conquer, but destroy. It is our homes that are invaded by the robber and the outlaw, our firesides, our wives, women, and children. Sons of the South, be men, be men." In the wake of Bull Run, Northern clergymen faced the difficult task of balancing a just cause with a disastrous defeat. Somehow the two had to be kept simultaneously in view if the right lessons were to be learned. God favored the North, but besetting sins obviously had led him to chastise the North before he would grant them triumph. In Hartford, the Reverend Horace Bushnell, Yale Divinity School, class of 1832, perhaps second only to Henry Ward Beecher as the voice of the white Protestant North, preached a sermon on the Sunday following Bull Run entitled "Reverses Needed." These guys could be masochists, so. The story was widely circulated and excerpted in the religious and secular press. The reasons for the sermon's importance are not hard to discover. From the start, it offered an apologia of suffering that would transcend trite appeals to Sabbath observance. Many Northern ministers were saying the besetting sin is that we fought the battle on Sunday. Because we fought the battle on Sunday, God gave us defeat. Bushnell wasn't interested in that. He addresses the very meaning of America. Bushnell's question was not original to him, and it would never disappear from American public discourse. Was the nation merely a political republic, or was it a Christian republic, conditioned by its Puritan legacy to be a self-consciously covenant people? For the Confederacy, as was already evident, this was simply not an issue. They cast themselves from the start as an indissoluble Christian republic. But for the North, an ambiguity existed that could, in Bushnell's view, prove fatal to the republic. Bushnell was angry, and not only at the slaveholding South. He was angry at the fact of defeat, and he was angry with his nation's secular evolution, which he believed had prompted it. The Confederate cause was evil, but the rhetoric of being a Christian nation was correct. This was what God wanted to see for the righteous North. For Bushnell, this meant that Americans must recognize the mistakes and shortcomings of the Founding Fathers. And not only them, but also any present politicians who accepted the Fathers' secular sentiments uncritically, including President Lincoln. The greatest transgression was neither petty sins nor poor leadership, but bad philosophy. Bushnell's idea of freedom was not grounded in Lockean and Jeffersonian epistemology, natural rights, nor the premises of the Declaration of Independence, but in the Puritans. Without ever mentioning Lincoln by name, Bushnell complained, quote, "Our statesmen or politicians, not being generally religious men, take up with difficulty conceptions of government or the foundations of government that suppose the higher rule of God. Our political theories never gave us a real nationality, but only a co-partnership. And the armed treason is only the consummated result of our speculations. Where nothing exists but a consent, what can be needed to end it but a descent? Left only with Jeffersonian categories and Lincoln's political religion of republicanism, no transcendent ground remained to oppose secession, for there was no higher cause superintended by a higher power. In this case, the success or failure of secession rested solely on coercion and superior firepower, not morality. Republicanism without God and a non-Christian constitution, Bushnell felt, was immoral. The perpetuation of a truly providential government as distinct from an abstract government grounded in natural law theories of contract was its own moral imperative for a just war. To signify this, Bushnell added his voice to the clamor for a constitutional amendment invoking God. Not surprisingly, Confederate preachers and moralists read about all this and continue to celebrate the inclusion of God in their Constitution. In his Thanksgiving sermon preached at Flat Rock, South Carolina, Edward Reed reiterated that the federal Constitution was fatally flawed. Quote, "Whether through inadvertence or, as is unfortunately more probable, from infidel practices imbibed in France by some members of the Constitution, names left out, it contained no recognition of God. Our present Constitution opens with a confession of the existence and providence of the Almighty." This, Reed exulted, continued in the aftermath of Bull Run. Quote, "To see the supreme legislature of a people, in the first moment of a decisive victory, turning its hall of legislation into a temple, returning solemn thanks to Almighty God, and then adjourning for the day is a spectacle which fills the heart of the Christian patriot with the liveliest joy." Not all states were as comfortable as the Confederate clergy and the insulated Northeast with the justness of the war. Missouri's experience with a savage civil war within its own borders that would continue throughout the whole period of the Civil War, waged indiscriminately on civilians, dispelled all romantic and world regenerative illusions. The Reverend R.H. Weller's fast sermon to Christ Church in St. Joseph, Missouri, contained no patriotism and is illustrative of what other ministers could have said, but seldom did. In the face of mounting terrorist attacks fought in the name of patriotism in Missouri, I'm talking about bushwhackers they were called, Weller assigned equal guilt and culpability to the North and the South. Quote, "Is it not a repetition of the sad calamity that befell Israel of old, a disrupted country with its rival capitals, and the hands of brethren imbued in brethren's blood? Though nominally Christian," Weller continued, "our practice has given the lie to our pretensions, and practically we are a nation of infidels." Such words he knew would not endear him to those aching for a fight. Talk of peace was downright offensive, quote, "amidst the heat of passion and the lynx-eyed gaze of partisanship." In contrast to Northern preachers who would declare that law is vengeance, Weller preached reconciliation. In place of patriotism, he proclaimed peace. Quote, "Let us strive to lay aside passion and prejudice, to hold fast to charity, to to covet the good things of God's blessing, the things which make for peace. The paucity of sermons like Weller's reveals the real object of fast days to promote patriotism and an unquestionably just war. Victory might be glorious, but the citizens in Richmond tasted battles to an unsettling degree. It should be no surprise, then, that they were among the first to become true believers. The themes of the Jeremiah dominated local unpublished oratory, as well as printed sermons and official pronouncements. Few unpublished sermons remain from the midst of war, but one remarkably complete selection survives from Richmond's Jeremiah Bell Jeter, pastor of the Third Baptist Church, co-founder of the Southern Baptist Convention, and regretful owner of slaves. Throughout the war, Jeter preached weekly in Richmond at the Grace Street Church. At the front of his sermon book, he wrote, quote, "This volume of notes was prepared during the war. Many sermons I prepared during that period with the roar of battle in my ears." When word reached Richmond in late June 1862 that Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson had attacked on the peninsula and pushed General George McClellan's mighty army away from the city, Jeter promptly penned a Thanksgiving sermon, quote, on the occasion of the national victories. The coincidence of victory with another fast was, to Jeter's eye, clearly causal. At first, quote, it was a dark day for the Confederacy. But then the Confederacy knelt in national humiliation, and in one response, God smiled upon his people. Apart from some naval defeats, victory occurred on almost every front. Again, to quote Jeter, "The siege of Richmond has been raised. The enemy was on the defensive. What meaning should be taken from this?" he asked. Victories, quote, "are not to be ascribed to the number or skills of our troops, nor to the superiority of our generals, but to the divine hand." Like virtually all of his peers, North and South, Jeter had no moral commentary on the scale of carnage. Throughout the war, this would remain a taboo subject. With commentary such as this, it is not surprising that the fast was rapidly becoming a martial totem. Through their prayers, ministers and people could share in the glory for their victory. Theologically, most ministers agreed that fasts or thanksgivings could not magically ensure earthly triumphs. But this, and I've just seen it time and time again in American history, when victories came, they simply could not resist the assumption that their piety had commended or at least cajoled God's orchestration of events in the field. Had a defeat followed the fast, ministers would either say nothing or complain that the people were not sufficiently sincere. In the inclusive world of the Jeremiad, incompetence in the field was not a sufficient explanation for defeat. In this sense, the home front could also share in the shame of their common defeat. And just a word in conclusion. In concluding this first lecture, I should nod briefly to our present days and say that I'm always struck at the way news writers and politicians routinely treat events in the present as new and unprecedented. You can throw sociologists and political scientists in there, too. We hear a lot today about moral majorities, a Christian America, just wars fought in the name of American goodness. The overlapping in religion and politics could hardly be more blatant. And we hear it as though it had just been invented by 20th century, primarily Republicans. But a review of the moral and religious arguments put forward in the Civil War reveals that contemporary rhetoric about a Christian America is at least as old as the Republican Party, founded in 1856. As I wrote my book, and then these lectures, the echoes between past and present were ear-shattering. Flag culture permeates both. A Christian republic stands in the balance, and wars for freedom have God on their side. Sadly, in the two lectures to follow, we will encounter other parallels to our world today, both in the domain of proportionality, the subject of tomorrow's lecture, and discrimination, the subject of Lecture 3. Thank you for your attention.